Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. This time, we continue our reading of The Christmas Mouse by Miss Reed. She supposed, leaning back now in the armchair, that her extreme tiredness had brought his face before her tonight. It was not a handsome face, to be sure, but it was kind and gentle, and from all she heard, Ray Bullen had both those qualities as well as strong principles. He was a Quaker, she knew, and she remembered a little passage about Quakers from the library book she was reading, something about them making the best chocolate and being very thoughtful and wealthy and good. It had amused her at the time, and though Ray Bullen could never be said to be wealthy, he was certainly thoughtful and good. She became conscious of her mother's voice, garrulous in her nervousness. It's funny how you can sense them when you're frightened of them. Not that I had any premonition tonight. I was too busy thinking about getting those pillowcases safely upstairs. But I well remember helping my aunt clear out her scullery when I was a child, no older than Frances I was then, and she asked me to lift a little old keg she kept her flour in, and I began to tremble, and I told her I just couldn't do it. There's a mouse in there, I told her. She was so wild. Rubbish, she stormed. She was a quick-tempered woman, red-haired and plump, and couldn't bear to be crossed. Pick it up at once. And so I did, and when I looked inside, there was a mouse, dead as a doornail and smelling so high to heaven. I dropped that double quick, you can be sure, and it rolled against a bottle of cider and smashed it to smithereens. Not that I waited to see it happen, I was down at the end of the garden in the privy with the door bolted. She couldn't get at me there. Mary had heard the tale many times, but would not have dreamed of reminding her mother of the fact. It was her mother's way, she realized, of apologizing for the trouble she was causing. Mrs. Barry hated to be a nuisance, and now, with Mary so near to complete exhaustion, she was being the biggest nuisance possible, the old lady told herself guiltily. Why must that dratted mouse arrive in her bedroom on Christmas Eve? In the silence that had fallen, there was the unmistakable click of a mousetrap. Mary leaped to her feet. Thank God, said Mrs. Barry in all seriousness. Panic seized her once more. Don't let me see it, Mary, will you? I can't bear to see their tails hanging down. I'll bring the whole thing down in the wastepaper basket, promised Mary. But when she returned to the apprehensive old lady waiting below, she had nothing in her hand. He took a nibble and then got away, she said. We'll have to wait a bit longer. I've set it a mite finer this time. I wish you had a braver mother, said Mrs. Barry forlornly. Mary smiled at her, and her mother's heart turned over. The girl looked 10 years younger when she smiled. She didn't smile enough, that was the trouble. Time she got over Bertie's loss. There was a time for grieving and a time to stop grieving. After all, she was still young, and smiling as she was now, very pretty too. Conversation lapsed, and the two tired women listened to the little intimate domestic noises of the house, the whispering of the flames, the hiss of a damp log, the rattle of the loose-fitting window. Outside, the rain fell down pitilessly. Mrs. Barry wondered if the rolled-up towel was stemming the flood at the back door, but was too tired to go and see. She must have dozed, for when she looked at the clock, it was almost 11. Mary was sitting forward in her chair, eyes fixed dreamily on the fire, miles away from Shepherd's Cross. She stirred as her mother sat up. I'll go and see if we've had any luck. Up the stairs she tiptoed once more and returned almost immediately. She looked deathly pale with tiredness, and Mrs. Barry's heart was moved. Still empty. He's a fly one, that mouse. What shall we do? Mrs. Barry took charge with a flash of her old energy and spirit. You're going to bed, my girl. You're about done in, I can see. I'll stay down here for the night, for to go up to that bedroom I simply cannot do. But, Mum, it's such a beast of a night. You'd be better off in bed. Just wake me if the trap springs, and I'll come and see to it. It's no bother, honest. No, Mary, you've done more than enough, and tomorrow's a busy day. I'll be all right here in the armchair. 'Tisn't the first time I've slept downstairs, and the storm don't trouble me. Mary looked doubtfully at the old lady, but could see that her mind was made up. All right then, Mum. I'll go and fetch your eiderdown and pillow. and see you've got enough firing handy. Yet again she mounted the stairs while Mrs. Barry made up the fire and bravely went to have a quick look at the towel by the back door. No more water had seeped in, so presumably the defenses are doing their work satisfactorily. She returned to the snug living room to find Mary plumping up the pillow. "Now you're sure you're all right?" she asked anxiously. "If I hear that trap go off before I get to sleep, shall I call you?" "No, my dear, you'll be asleep as soon as your head hits the pillow tonight, I can see that. I shall settle here and be perfectly happy." Mary retrieved the pillowcases, kissed her mother's forehead, and went to the staircase for the last time that night. "Sleep well," she said, smiling at her mother, who was now wrapped in the eiderdown. "You look as snug as a bug in a rug, as the children say." "Good night, Mary. You're a good girl," said her mother, watching the door close behind her daughter. Nearly 11:30, thought Mrs. Barry. What a time to go to bed. 10 o'clock was considered quite late enough for the early risers of Shepherd's Cross. She struggled from her wrappings to turn off the light and to put a very small coal on the back of the fire. The room was very pretty and cozy by the flickering firelight. There was no sound from upstairs. All three of them thought Mrs. Barry would be asleep by now, and that wretched mouse still making free in her own bedroom, no doubt. Ah, well, she was safe enough down here, and there was something very companionable about a fire in the room when you were settling down for the night. She turned her head into the feather filled pillow. Outside, the storm still raged, and she could hear the rain drumming relentlessly upon the roof and the road. It made her own comfort doubly satisfying. God pity all poor travelers on a night like this, thought Mrs. Barry, pulling up the eiderdown. There's one thing, I shan't be awake long, storm or no storm. She sighed contentedly and composed herself for slumber. Chapter 5. But tired though she was, Mrs. Barry could not get to sleep. Perhaps it was the horrid shock of the mouse, or the unusual bustle of Christmas that had overtired her. Whatever the reason, the old lady found herself gazing at the rosy reflection of the fire on the ceiling, her mind drifting from one inconsequent subject to the next. The bubbling of the rain forced its way through the crack of the window and reminded her of the more ominous threat at the back door. Well, she told herself, that towel was standing up to the onslaught when she looked a short while ago. It must just take its chance. In weather like this, unusual precautions were not enough. Stanley would have known what to do. A rolled up towel wouldn't have been good enough for him. Some sturdy carpentry would have made sure the back door was completely weatherproof. Mrs. Barry sighed and thought wistfully of their manless state. Two good husbands gone, and no sons growing up to take their place in the household. It seemed hard, but the ways of God were inscrutable, and who was to say why he had taken them first? She thought of her first meeting with Stanley when she was 19 and he 2 years older. She had been in service then at the vicarage. Her employer was a predecessor of Mr. Partridge's, a bachelor who held the living of Fairacre for many years. He was a vague, saintly man, a great Hebrew scholar who had written a number of learned commentaries on the minor prophets of the Old Testament. His parishioners were proud of his scholarship, but between themselves admitted that he was only ninepence in the shilling when it came to practical affairs. Nevertheless, the vicarage was well run by a motherly old body who had once been a nurse to a large family living in a castle in the next county. This training stood her in good stead when she took over the post of housekeeper to the vicar of Fairacre. She was methodical, energetic, and abundantly kind. When a vacancy occurred for a young maid at the vicarage, Mrs. Barry's parents thought she would be extremely lucky to start work in such pleasant surroundings. They applied for the post for their daughter, then aged 13. Despite her lonely upbringing in the gamekeeper's cottage, Amelia Scott, as she was then, was a friendly child, anxious to help and blessed with plenty of common sense. The housekeeper realized her worth and trained her well, letting her help in the kitchen as well as learning the secrets of keeping the rest of the establishment sweet and clean. She thrived under the old lady's tuition and learned by her example to respect the sterling qualities of her employer. He was always ready to help his neighbors, putting aside his papers to assist anyone in trouble and welcoming all, even the malodorous vagrants who took advantage of him, according to the housekeeper, all into his study to give them refreshment of body and spirit. One bright June morning, when the dew sparkled on the roses, Amelia heard the chinking of metal on the stone and leaned out of the bedroom window to see two men at work on one of the buttresses of St. Patrick's Church. The noise continued all the morning, and as the sun rose in the blue arc of a cloudless sky, she wondered if the master would send her across with a jug of cider to wash down the men's dinners, as he often did. Then she remembered that he was out visiting at the other end of the parish. The housekeeper, too, was out on an errand. She was choosing the two plumpest young fowls, now running about in the neighbor's chicken run, for the Sunday meal. Amelia was helping Bertha, the senior housemaid, to clean out the attics when they heard the ringing of the back door bell. "You run and see to that," said Bertha, her arms full of derelict pillows. "I'll carry on here." Amelia sped downstairs through the shadows and sunlight that streaked the faded blue carpet and opened the back door. A young man with thick brown hair and very bright dark eyes smiled at her apologetically. He held his left hand, which was heavily swathed in a red spotted handkerchief, in his right one, and dark stains showed that he was bleeding profusely. "Been a bit clumsy," he said. "My tools slipped." "Come in," said Amelia, very conscious that she was alone to cope with this emergency. She led the way to the scullery and directed the young man to the shallow slate sink. "Put your hand in that bowl," she told him, "and I'll pump some water. It's very pure. We've got one of the deepest wells in the parish." It was certainly a nasty gash, and the pure water, so warmly recommended by Amelia, was soon cloudy with blood. "Keep swilling it around," directed Amelia, quite enjoying her command of the situation, "while I get a bit of rag to bandage it." "There's no need, miss," protested the young man. "It's stopping. Look." He held out the finger, but even as he did so, the blood began to well again. Amelia took one look and went to the bandage drawer in the kitchen dresser. Here, old pieces of linen sheeting were kept for just such an emergency, and the housekeeper's pot of homemade salve stood permanently on the shelf above. No one quite knew what the ingredients of this cure-all were, for the recipe's secret was jealously guarded, but goose grease played a large part in it, along with certain herbs that the old lady gathered from the hedgerows. During the first during the few years of Amelia's residence at the vicarage, she had seen this salve used for a variety of ailments, from chilblains to the vicar's shaving rash, and always with good results. She returned now with the linen and the pot of ointment. The young man still smiled, and Amelia smiled back. "Let me wrap it up," she said. "Let's put some of this stuff on first." "What's in it?" "Nothing to hurt you," Amelia assured him. "It's good for everything. Cured some spots I had on my chin quicker 'n lightning." "I don't believe you ever had spots," said the young man gallantly. He held out the wounded finger, and Amelia twisted the strip round and round deftly, cutting the end in two to make a neat bow. "There," she said with pride. "Now you'll be more comfortable." "Thank you, miss. You've been very kind." He picked up the bloodied handkerchief. "Leave that here," said Amelia, "and I'll wash it for you." "No call to trouble you with that," said the young man. "My ma will wash it when I get back." "Bloodstains need soaking in cold water," Amelia told him, "and the sooner the better. I'll put it to soak now and then wash it out." "Well, thank you. We're working on the church for the rest of the week. Can I call in tomorrow to get it?" Amelia felt a glow of pleasure at the thought of seeing him again so soon. She liked his thick hair, his quick eyes, and his well-tanned skin, a proper nut-brown man, and polite, too. Amelia looked at him with approval. "I'll be here," she promised. "My name's Barry," said the young man. "Stanley Barry. What's yours?" "Amelia Scott." "Well, thank you, Amelia, for a real good job. I must be getting back to work or I'll get sacked." She watched him cross the garden in the shimmering heat, the white bandage vivid against the brown background of his skin and clothes. He paused in the gateway leading to the churchyard, waving back to her. Delighted, she waved in return. "You've taken your time," grumbled Bertha when she returned to the attic. She looked at Amelia's radiant face shrewdly. "Who do you see down there, Prince Charming?" Amelia forbore to answer, but thought that Bertha seemed to have guessed correctly. The next morning, the young man called to collect his handkerchief. Amelia had washed and ironed it with extreme care and put it carefully on the corner of the dresser to await its owner. He carried a bunch of pink roses, and at the sight of them, Amelia felt suddenly shy. "You shouldn't have bothered," she began, but the young man hastily put her at her ease. "My ma sent them to thank you for what you did and for washing the handkerchief. She said you're quite right. She'd have had the devil's own job to get the stain out if I'd left it till evening." Amelia took the bunch and smelled them rapturously. Please thank her for them. They're lovely. I'll put them in my room. Stanley gave her a devastating smile again. I picked them, he said gently. Then thank you too, said Amelia, handing over the handkerchief. They stood in silence for a moment, gazing at each other, loath to break the spell of this magic moment. Best be goin', said Stanley at length. He gave a gusty sigh, which raised Amelia's spirits considerably, and set off, stuffing the handkerchief in his pocket. He had not gone more than a few steps when he halted and turned. Can I come again, Amelia? Please, said Amelia, with rather more fervor than a well bred young lady should have shown. But then Amelia always spoke her mind. There was no looking back, no hesitation, no lovers' quarrels. From that first meeting, they trod a smooth, blissful, happy path of courtship. They were both even tempered, considerate people, having much the same background, and most important of all, the same sense of fun. There were no family difficulties, and the wedding took place on a spring day as sunny as that on which they had first met. They lived for the first few years at Beech Green, in a small cottage thatched by Dolly Clare's father, who was one of their neighbors. The first two girls were born there, and then the house at Shepherd's Cross was advertised to let. It was considerably bigger than their first house, and although it meant a longer cycle ride for Stanley, this did not deter him. Here Mary was born. They had hoped for a boy this time, but the baby was so pretty and good that the accident of her sex was speedily forgotten. Amelia and Stanley were true homemakers. Amelia's early training at the vicarage had given her many skills. She could make frocks for the children, curtains, bedspreads, and rag rugs as competently as she could make a cottage pie or a round of shortbread. The house always looked as bright as a new pin, and Stanley saw to it that any stonework or woodwork was in good repair. They shared the gardening, and it was Mrs. Barry's pride that they never needed to buy a vegetable. The longing for a son had never left Amelia. She liked a man about the place, and it was doubly grievous when Stanley died so suddenly. She lost not only her lover and husband, but the comfort of all that a shared life meant. Mary's Bertie brought back to the cottage the feeling of comfort and reliability. The birth of her grandson had meant more to Mrs. Barry than she cared to admit. It was the continuance of male protection that subconsciously she needed. The baby's early death was something she mourned as deeply as Mary and Bertie had. A piece of wood fell from the fire, and Mrs. Barry stirred herself to reach for the tongs and replace it. Not yet midnight. She seemed to have been lying there for hours, dreaming of times past. Poor Stanley, poor Bertie, poor baby. But what a blessing the two little girls were. Mary knew how to bring up children. Plenty of fun, but no nonsense when it came to doing as they were told. Say what you will, thought old Mrs. Barry, it didn't do people any harm to have a little discipline. You could cosset them too much and give in to their every whim, and what happiness did that bring? She remembered neighbors in the early days of her marriage at Beech Green. They were an elderly pair when their first child arrived, a pale, sickly little fellow called, with much ribaldry of some of the Beech Green folk, Clarence. The baby was only put out into the garden on the warmest days, and then he was so swaddled in clothes that his normally waxen complexion was beaded with perspiration. The doctor harangued the doting mother. Friends and neighbors, genuinely concerned for the child's health, proffered advice. Nothing was of any avail. Clarence continued to be smothered with love. Not surprisingly, he was late in walking and talking. When he was at the toddling stage, his mother knitted him a long pair of reins in scarlet wool, and these were used in all his walks abroad. Mrs. Barry herself had seen the child tethered by these same red reins to the fence near the back door so that his mother could keep an eye on him as she worked. He was a docile child, too languid to protest against his restrictions, and never having known freedom, he accepted his lot with a sweet meekness that other mothers found pathetic. Clarence reached the age of 6, still cosseted, still adored, still forbidden the company of rough playmates who might harm him. But one bleak December day, he fell ill with some childish infection that a normal boy would have thrown off in a day or two. Clarence drooped and died within the week, and the grief of his parents was terrible to see. Poor Clarence in his red reins, thought Mrs. Barry, looking back over the years. She thought of him as the sweet dove that died in Keats' poem. Long, long ago, she had learned it, chanting with the other children in the village school, and still, 70 years on, she could remember it. I had a dove, and the sweet dove died, and I have thought it died of grieving. Oh, what could it grieve for? Its feet were tied with a silken thread of my own hands weaving, sweet little red feet. Why should you die? Why should you leave me, sweet bird? Why? You lived alone in the forest tree. Why, pretty thing, would you not live with me? I kissed you oft and gave you white peas. Why not live sweetly as in the green trees? Yes, that was Clarence, tied with the silken thread of his poor mother's weaving. The stricken parents had moved away soon after the tragedy, and very little was heard of them, although someone once said that the mother had been taken to the madhouse years later and was never fit to be released. Thank God, thought Mrs. Barry, turning her pillow, that children were brought up more sensibly these days. She thought of Mary's two vivacious daughters, their glossy hair and round pink cheeks, their exuberance, their inexhaustible energy. Well, they were quite enough at the moment, though no doubt they would wake early and fill the house. Excuse me. Well, they were quiet enough at the moment, though no doubt they would wake early and fill the house with their excitement. Mrs. Barry rearranged the eiderdown, turned her cheek to the pillow, and thanking God for the blessing of a family, fell asleep at last. Chapter 6. An unaccustomed sound woke the old lady within an hour. She slept lightly these days, and the stirring of one of her granddaughters or the mewing of a cat was enough to make her instantly alert. She lay listening for the sound again. The wind still moaned and roared outside. The rain pattered fitfully against the window pane, and the fire whispered as the wood ash fell through the bars of the grate. It was a metallic noise that had roused her. What could it be? It might possibly be caused by part of the metal trellis which she and Mary had erected against the front porch to aid the growth of a new rose. Could it have blown loose? But she could have sworn that the sound was nearer at hand, somewhere inside the house. It was not the welcome click of the mousetrap at its work. Something downstairs. She sat upright in the chair. The fire had burned very low, and she leaned forward to put a little more wood on it, taking care to make no noise. Her ears strained for a repetition of the sound. Now she thought she could hear a slight scuffling noise. A bird? Another mouse? Her heart began to beat quickly. And then the tinny sound again, as though a lid were being lifted from a light saucepan or a cake tin. Without doubt, someone was in the kitchen. Mrs. Barry sat very still for a minute. She felt no fear, but she was cautious. She certainly did not intend to rouse the sleeping family above. Whoever it was, Mrs. Barry felt quite capable of coping with him. Some rough old tramp, probably, seeking a dry billet from the storm, and, if left alone, on his way before the house stirred at daybreak. Mrs. Barry began to feel justifiable annoyance at the thought of some wastrel making free with her accommodation, and, what was more to the point, rifling the larder. She bent to pick up the poker from the hearth. There was only one chance in 10 that she would need to use it, but it was well to be armed. It gave her extra confidence, and should the man be so silly as to show fight, then she would lay about her with energy and leave him marked. Tightening her dressing gown cord around her ample waist, Mrs. Barry, poker in hand, moved silently to the door of the living room. This door, then a short passage, and then the kitchen door needed to be negotiated before she came face to face with her adversary. Mrs. Barry determined to take the obstacles at a rush, catching the intruder before he had a chance to make his escape. For one brief moment before she turned the doorknob, the battered face of an old woman swam into Mrs. Barry's mind. The photograph had been given pride of place in the local paper only that week and showed the victim of some young hooligan who had broken into her pathetic home to take what they could. Well, Mrs. Barry told herself sturdily, such things might happen in a town. It wouldn't occur in this homely little place like Shepherd's Cross. She had dealt with plenty of scoundrels in her day and knew that a stout heart was the best defense against bullies. Right would always triumph in the end, and no good ever came of showing fear. She took a deep breath, a firmer grip on the poker, and flung open the door. 4 quick, determined steps took her to the kitchen door. She twisted the knob and pushed the door open with her foot. There was a stifled sound, something between a sob and a scream, a scuffle, and an unholy clattering as a large tin fell upon the tiles of the kitchen floor. Mrs. Barry switched on the light with her left hand, raised the poker menacingly in her right, and advanced upon her adversary. Upstairs, Jane stirred. She lay still for a minute or two, relishing the warmth of her sister's back against hers and the delicious warm hollow in which her cheek rested. Then she remembered and sat up. It was just light enough to see that the two empty suit pillowcases had vanished. She crept carefully out of bed and went to the foot. There on the floor stood two beautifully knobbly pillowcases, and across each lay an equally beautiful striped stocking. He had been. Father Christmas had been. Wild excitement was followed by a wave of shame, and she had not seen him. She had fallen asleep after all her resolutions. It would be a whole year now before she could put Tom Williams' assertion to the test again. She shivered in the cold draft that blew under the door. Her hands stroked the bulging stocking lovingly. There was the tangerine, and there were the sweets, and this must be a dear little doll at the top. If only morning would come. She did not intend to undo the presents now. She would wait until Francis woke. She crept back to bed, shivering with cold and excitement. She thrust her head into the hollow of her pillow again, leaned back comfortably against her sister, sighed rapturously at the thought of joys to come, and fell asleep again within a minute. Mrs. Barry's stern gaze, which had been directed to a point about 6 feet from the ground, at a height where her enemy's head should reasonably have been, now fell almost 2 feet to rest upon a pale, wretched urchin dressed in a streaming wet raincoat. At his feet lay Mrs. Barry's cake tin, luckily right way up, with her cherished Madeira cake exposed to the night air. The lid of the cake tin lay 2 yards away, where it had crashed to the ground. "Pick that up," said Mrs. Barry in a terrible voice, pointing imperiously with the poker. Sniveling, the child did as he was told and put it on the table. "Now the lid," said Mrs. Barry with awful emphasis. The boy sidled nervously toward it, his eyes fixed fearfully upon the menacing poker. He retrieved it and replaced it fumblingly, Mrs. Barry watching the while. The floor was wet with footmarks. The sodden towel had been pushed aside by the opening door. Mrs. Barry remembered with a guilty pang that she had forgotten to lock the door amidst the general excitement of Christmas Eve. She looked disapprovingly at the child's feet, which had played such havoc upon the kitchen tiles. They were small, not much bigger than Jane's, and clad in a pair of sneakers that squelched with water every time the boy moved. He had no socks, and his legs were mauve with cold and covered with goosebumps. Mrs. Barry's motherly heart was smitten, but no sign of softening showed in her stern face. This boy was nothing more than a common housebreaker and a thief. A minute more, and her beautiful Madeira cake with its artistic swirl of angelica across the top would have been demolished, gulped down by this filthy ragamuffin. Nevertheless, one's Christian duty must be done. "Take off those shoes and your coat," commanded Mrs. Barry, "and bring them in by the fire. I want to know more about you, my boy." He struggled out of them and picked them up in a bundle in his arms. His head hung down, and little droplets of water ran from his bangs down his cheeks. Mrs. Barry unhooked the substantial striped roller towel from the back of the door and motioned to the boy to precede her into the living room. "And don't you dare make a sound," said Mrs. Barry in a fierce whisper. "I'm not having everyone woken up by a rapscallion like you." She prodded him in the back with the poker and followed her reluctant victim to the fireside. He was obviously completely exhausted and was about to sink into one of the armchairs, but Mrs. Barry stopped him. "Oh, no, you don't, my lad, dripping wet as you are. You towel yourself dry before you mess up my furniture." The boy took the towel and rubbed his soaking hair and wet face. Mrs. Barry studied him closely. Now that she had time to look at him, she saw that the child was soaked to the skin. He was dressed in a t-shirt and gray flannel shorts, both dark with rainwater. "Here, strip off," commanded Mrs. Barry. "Eh?" said the boy, alarmed. "You heard what I said. Take off those wet clothes, everything you've got on." The child's face began to pucker. He was near to tears. "Lord, boy," said Mrs. Barry testily, "I shan't look at you. In any case, I've seen plenty of bare boys in my time. Do as you're told, and I'll get you an old coat to put on while your things dry." She stood a chair near the fire and hung the child's sodden coat across the back of it. His small sneakers were placed on the hearth on their sides to dry. The boy slowly divested himself of his wet clothing, modestly turning his back toward the old lady. She thrust more wood upon the fire, looking at the blaze with satisfaction. And we'll continue this story next time.